Good evening. Welcome to the NAACP Forum. We are so happy that you're able to join us this evening for the forum on racism, implicit bias, and cultural competency in our schools. We're asking that everyone, as you join us this evening, turn your sound to mute as you're joining in, so that we can hear from everyone and that everyone can participate and join in a while. I will be providing instructions and directions in a minute, but I'm gonna let everyone join in and then we're gonna get started. Thank you again. We also wanna welcome all the folks that are joining us this evening on Facebook, here in Indiana and throughout the country. We are excited to have this conversation. It is important that as we are having these conversations around the country about police brutality, about the COVID-19 pandemic, about what is going on in our cities and counties across the country, that we have a thoughtful and really rigorous conversation about how we can transform our classroom. So I'm so excited to have you all join us tonight. And I can't wait to introduce you all to our fine set of panelists and to the conversation that we're gonna have this evening. So I'm gonna give folks a couple more seconds to join in and to get your evening drink or beverage and get set up in a nice, comfortable place in your home or your office. And we're gonna have a good conversation. Well, if it's all right, I want to get started and begin to start this conversation so that we have more than enough time this evening to really dig deep and to dive in to these questions. I'm so excited to see your smiling faces. I was just scrolling through the Zoom pages, and it is awesome to see that we have over 150 people who are joining us tonight through Zoom, more people that are joining us throughout Facebook. And we want to say thank you. We want to say thank you that you have agreed that this conversation is important and critical for the time that we live in. We want to say thank you that you've taken this time out of your evening to join with us. We really want to say thank you because we know this is going to be a tough conversation, but it is a necessary one. My name is Joseph Tucker Edmonds. I'm a professor of Africana Studies and Religious Studies at Indiana University, Purdue University at Indianapolis, IUPUI. I am also a member of the Greater Indianapolis branch of the NAACP. I am the president of the local branch of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. I love Indianapolis and the work that so many of you all are doing here in this city. And I'm excited about the conversation that we're gonna have tonight about implicit bias, racism, and cultural competency in our classrooms. So welcome you all this evening. Welcome you to this conversation. I wanna really thank the Greater Indianapolis branch NAACP for sponsoring and organizing this event, for putting us together and bringing us into this space. I also want to thank the president of the Greater Indianapolis branch of the NAACP, Crystal Ratcliffe, for her leadership and her vision, for always wanting to be on the front lines, for always committing us to having great conversations, for always being willing to bring folks together so that we can have a conversation that is not only informative, but really is going to be transformative by the end of our conversation by 7:30, 7:35 this evening. We really want to make a change by the conversations that we're having and the real engagement that we're going to be involved in. So again, I thank you for coming out. And I want to just begin with a couple of quick comments. And then I want to introduce our panelists. And we want to jump right into the questions that you saw on the flyer and the questions that have been organizing and animating the reason why we've come together tonight. So let me jump in with a few quick comments, and then I want to introduce our panelists and then jump in to the conversation. We have and we continue to live in perilous times. Let us not be fooled but the foundations of anti-Black racism are really no different than when African bodies were forcibly shipped to this country over 400 years ago. While the foundations are similar, the presentation and the policies of anti-Black racism have evolved, right? Unfortunately, those policies are everywhere, whether they are the fact that African Americans experience police brutality and death at 2.5 times the rate of white Americans, that Black and brown students are suspended at almost 5 times the rate of their white counterparts or 10 times the rate of their Asian counterparts, or that African Americans are hospitalized and experience serious illness from COVID-19 and COVID-19 related diseases at 5 times the rate of other Americans. This is not because of poor decision-making or pathology or simply being at the wrong place at the wrong time, but this is due to centuries of policies and practices that make it virtually untenable, virtually impossible, virtually impractical to be both Black and safe and free. We live in really difficult times right now. And so I wanted to turn to what Ibram Kendi in his text, How to Be an Anti-Racist, suggests. He argues that terms like implicit bias or terms like structural racism or even terms like white fragility are or can be problematic if they hide what is at the core of anti-Black racism and violence, right? So I want us tonight, we're gonna unpack those terms. When we use the terms white fragility, when we use the terms, structural racism, when we use the term implicit bias, I'm hoping that our panelists will unpack those for us because as Dr. Kendi says, he says, these terms can be problematic if they hide the fact that centuries and layers of policies are really what hold these practices and values and norms in place. If these terms allow us to focus too doggedly on bad people or bad individuals or sometimes problematic pedagogies without unpacking the ways in which they are deeply connected to these kinds of policies and practices that have been sustained over centuries, then we are doing something wrong. We need to do the work of unpacking and unthinking these kinds of things. So as we think of implicit bias as not just a pedagogical issue, right? It's not just something that we need to just fix around the edges in the classrooms, but that implicit bias has real life consequences for the success and safety of Black and brown students. And so we are coming today, as we talk about structural racism, as we talk about implicit bias, as we talk about white fragility, these are not just terms that we can banty around and that we can say we need to fix on the edges, but we've got to figure out what does it mean to dismantle? What does it mean to get rid of so that our students can actually survive? These are life and death terms. We can oftentimes overly intellectualize these terms and talk about them and think about them in these words, but I want us to think about these as urgent, that we need to respond to, that we need to query and unpack, and that we need to then move into very quickly thinking about what are the counter policies, right? What are the anti-racist logics? What are the proposals that we can now put into place that will strategically change the worlds and the classrooms and the spaces that our students live in, specifically our Black and brown students, that they can engage and live in a world where violence against their minds and their bodies and their well-beings is not something that we are accepting as normal and as okay, right? So again, like I said, this is heavy stuff, right? But we brought together a heavy panel, a deep and rich panel of folks who are going to help us unpack these terms, to kind of think about ways that we can move forward, to push us as a collective here, and hopefully to leave you unsettled by the end of the evening, right? That you will be pushed to think critically and to think profoundly about what we all need to do, what you need to do, and how we are going to do it as we leave this space, both here on Zoom and here in Facebook land, leave these virtual spaces and begin to affect real change in the lives of our students and our families and our communities. So again, thank you and welcome to this conversation. I wanted to thank the NAACP again for those of you who are just joining on with us, and the Equity Council of the Pike Township, because much of this conversation kind of came out of an earlier conversation that some folks between the NAACP and the Pike Township began to have around how the book White Fragility, or thinking about white fragility in our classrooms, needed to be unpacked, how we needed to challenge these notions of equity and access, and how we could actually move from a conversation around white fragility, move from a conversation around some of these other topics, to actually thinking about what we need to do on the ground in our districts, in our classrooms, and in our policy spaces. So we brought together these folks that I'm now going to introduce to begin to unpack how we move from terms like white fragility, implicit bias, and structural racism to real change and transformation in our classrooms. So I want to very quickly introduce some of the folks that have joined us tonight. First of all, I want to introduce Dr. Flora Reichenauer. Is that correct? Who grew up near the south side of Chicago, started her career in education as a teacher in the school city of East Chicago, Indiana. After a variety of administrative experiences, including as a superintendent in her 36 years of education, Dr. Flora was named as superintendent of schools 3 years ago, I believe, or maybe a little bit more than that, for the Metropolitan School District of Pike Township. She leads the district's equity councils and partners with the Great Lake Equity Center at IUPUI with a passion to disrupt the status quo. And so we're so happy to have you and for you to join with us in this conversation. In addition to Dr. Flora, we have with us Pat Payne, who is the director of the IPS, the Indianapolis Public Schools Racial Equity Officer. She has worked at IPS for 58 years and has led much of the effort. She is an activist, a leader, a visionary. Pat Payne is an amazing warrior, and she has been always on the front line to guide our teachers and our administrators to really think critically about race, equity, inclusion, and diversity. We are so happy to have her on the panel with us tonight. In addition to Pat Payne and Dr. Flora, we have Terrell Berry, who is a school improvement specialist with the Indiana Department of Education. He has been with IDOE for 3 years, and in addition, he brings experience from the Lawrence Township as well as IUPUI, where he has trained and worked with teachers to help them think about school improvement and equity. He holds a BS in African American Studies and an MA in Education from Earlham College, and holds an MBA in Educational Leadership from the Indiana State University. Welcome, Terrell, to the conversation. We also have with us Heather McKinney. Heather McKinney is a licensed educator and a building administrator who, from K through 12, who has taught, consulted, and administered at 8 Marion County Public School Districts and 3 Marion County charter schools. We are so excited to have a teacher and an administrator who's still working in the schools with us this evening. Welcome, Heather, to the conversation. We also have with us Dr. McCray, Valerie McCray, who works with victims of violence and families that have lost their loved ones to violence. She treats children that have been displaced due to abuse and neglect, or that have parents struggling with drug addiction or incarceration, or that have died from violence or drug overdose. She is a leader in this work around trauma and the effect of trauma, and we're so excited to have her because we know that racism does not just only impact the ability for folks to participate and engage from an academic or an environmental perspective, but also from a social and a mental capacity as well. And so we really want to bring in that, and we're so excited to have Dr. McCray to help us think through those topics. Welcome to the conversation. We also have Mashawn Wally joining us this evening. He serves as the policy director for the African American Coalition of Indianapolis. In this role, he helps the organization develop policy positions and is the spokesperson for the organization on a number of issues specifically related to education and educational advocacy. He is trained as a stratification economist and holds an MBA from the Kelley School of Business and an MPA from the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. We want to welcome Mashawn Wally to the conversation. And last but not least, we have Jill English, who is a facilitator and the director of Interrupting Racism for Children at Child Advocates. She has worked with abused and neglected children and their families for over 25 years, including serving as a guardian ad litem and a trainer of folks who do that work in the city and throughout Marion County. She has lived in Pike for 20 years, and her daughters are graduates of Pike High School. So as I said at the beginning, let's give everyone give them a round of applause. I want to see the hands. Yes, I want to see y'all still awake in Zoom land and Facebook land. Thank you. We have an amazing panel this evening. I just want to thank all of them for joining us, for bringing their expertise, for being willing to engage in this conversation. So the model for tonight is that we're gonna ask each panelist a targeted question. I talked to the panelists before we joined you this evening. We're gonna ask them a question. We're gonna give them a little time to respond. We'll give some of the other panelists a little time to rebut and to clarify. And then we wanna move to the over 150, over 200 people that are now joining us in Zoom land to ask questions, to engage, to critically encounter with us as we move through this process together. So I hope y'all are awake. I hope you all are engaged and excited, and I hope you are ready for a really powerful discussion that we can have now that can hopefully stem the tide, that can change the way that we think about urban and public education throughout Marion County and throughout the state of Indiana, and that we can really affect and move towards change. So thank you all for joining us. Thank our panelists. And I'm gonna jump in to the first question. And we're starting with Dr. Flora. So I'm gonna ask Dr. Flora to unmute herself right now. As I said at the beginning, that this conversation began or much of the impetus for some of this panel began around the work that you've been doing in Pike, Dr. Flora. We know that Pike is one of the school districts here in the state of Indiana that has a predominantly African-American population. I think the last statistic that I saw that said over 60%, is that correct, of the students in Pike are African-American. And so this is, we often think of Indianapolis or the Center City as a place where we have the majority population of students of color, but Pike is one of those places. And so I wanted to ask you very quickly, as a person that has been really responding very proactively to implicit bias and the well-being and academic success of African-American students, why do you and the Pike Township School District feel compelled to act courageously and creatively in light of systemic racism, white fragility, and African-American student success? What are you learning? What do you want to share with us? And how and where do we want to move forward? Dr. Flora.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I am so honored to be a part of this esteemed group of people to really continue the conversation. It's a conversation that we have regularly here in Pike Township, and one that of recently we've made a lot more public than we may have in the past. So just want to give you a little bit of background. I became superintendent here in Pike Township on January 1st of 2017. And I was given a legacy from Nathaniel Jones as superintendent to continue the effort of making sure that our students are successful and are proud graduates of Pike High School. We're fortunate at the time and continue to have very little discrepancy between our demographic groups when it comes to graduating from high school. And so I took that responsibility very seriously as I continued to do the first 6 months a job of listening and understanding and learning as those 6 months went by. And one of the things I really wanted to do at the time was to create a group of people with a common passion of making sure that we had an equitable education environment for our students. And so we knew that that was going to be something that would create some uncomfortable conversations for some and some celebrations for others, because we know it is something that is key to making sure that we are providing the space for our scholars to learn. And so as part of that work, we have evolved over the last 2 years and have been in partnership with the Great Lakes Equity Center to really disrupt the status quo. We are looking and tackling policies, curriculum, which is what we teach, instruction, which is how we teach. We're really concentrating on what is it that we need to do to really make a difference. The one thing I wanted to be sure was that we were not going to create an equity council that said, check in a box, that's done, hooray for us. We really want to make sure that we are truly disrupting the status quo, recognizing all of the things that you talked about, the implicit bias that exists, not only in Pike, but everywhere, as well as making sure that we truly understand the needs of our students and providing an opportunity for us to make it very public so that we can continue the work as well as bring in other allies in this work. It is hard, but it is worth every student in our district and in our city.
Thank you so much, Dr. Flora. I want to continue down that path, and of what it means for us to think about kind of like hanging on and being handed that baton and doing the work that is required when we realize that we have to impact change and affect change that may be difficult, may require courage in this regard. I want to move really quickly into this next question. And I'm going to bring in Pat Payne and Heather McKinney to begin to help us think through this question. The title of this panel is Racism, Implicit Bias, and Cultural Competency. And I want to ask you, both of you, how has racism and bias affected academic performance in the classroom? And can we talk about racism and bias without attention to racism and bias in the larger world that these students come in from? So how has racism and bias affected African-American performance in the classroom? And what should our response be to that if we know that it is having a negative or detrimental response? Let's start with Pat Payne, and then we'll move to Heather. Don't forget to unmute yourself. Uh-oh. There you are.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm telling you, me and technology. When you talk about racism, systemic racism, but it is all connected and has been since time began. I would say since we were brought over here over 400 years ago. That's when it all started, see. Our children in the classroom are victims of this. Our families are victims of this. And you can see that victimization so clearly now with this COVID-19. You can see the disparities. You can see the disproportionalities. Well, the same thing goes on in the classroom by many times very well-meaning people. But they have to understand that they too are victims of structural and systemic racism. And I never thought I would be able to see the day when people are actually feeling more and more comfortable saying the words systemic racism, systemic racism. That's what it is. And it runs through everything. It is insidious. It doesn't stop. And so when we have our training sessions, we would welcome in community people because they were going through the same thing. It's not only in education that this systemic racism runs, it is in everything. Racism is unrelenting. You see, just like COVID-19, it is unrelenting. And so that is why, I mean, we finally have a policy. We've had policies before, but this didn't just come up when the board decided to say, okay, it is time for us to do it. We've been trying to get a policy since, I would say, 1979 is when we first started working on this. And it started with a policy for the teaching of Black history in the classroom, because at that time, it was just Black and white students in the district. And so this has just slowly evolved. And then sometimes it would go backwards, and then it would go forward again until you had, but this racism, it is so insidious that people don't even see that it's going on. They don't recognize that it's going on, but it is in their thought pattern. So even when you have a policy, people have to unlearn all the stuff that they have learned because they've been taught lies. There's a book called by James Llewellyn, Lies My Teacher Taught Me. See? But it's not just the teacher, it's everything. It's the museums, it's the libraries, it's everywhere. That's the insidious nature, see? And so that is why I feel blessed almost to see all of these conversations finally going on everywhere you look. And that's what it's going to take. People talking, people willing to understand what they have done in the past and what they can do better.
I agree with everything Pat has said, and I want to publicly thank Pat for everything she has done. She was one of the first educators who ever gave me a very comprehensive binder on how to teach Black history in the classroom that I still have to this day. And so I can thank her for enjoying the poems of Paul Laurence Dunbar and about the absolute fabulous contributions of African Americans, and being more aware as a teacher on how to celebrate that culture, not just of the Harlem Renaissance, but numerous periods in world history, because Black history is our history collectively. It is all of our history, and it shouldn't just be stuck inside of a month, though we do that because of Howard Carter Woodson, who created that a week, and that was his birthday is in that month. But we as educators, all of us, it is our job to make sure that we are celebrating the culture of all of our students. And right now, greater than any time that we've ever had an opportunity, we cannot be silent, because silence is complicity. And we need to be on our A game, because racism has affected African American achievement and performance in the classroom. And unfortunately, it's a lot of white educators' faults, because implicit bias, just to have a working definition of that, unconsciously having prejudices or stereotypes against students for whatever reason, has impacted higher rates of suspension and expulsion. And if those students aren't in the classroom to learn, then their outcomes and achievements are going to have a negative impact on their education. And there's other things that prove the systemic racism that goes on: unequal access to key education resources. Again, I've worked in many districts and helped in many districts, and I can plainly see it with my own two eyes. There can be one school that has one-to-one technology per children, per child, per student, per scholar, and another school not even a block away that doesn't have any per student. It's just a lab where kids go to take tests on Fridays. So it's not okay to have inequity. It is not okay to tolerate it. Everybody who sees it needs to do something. And I am very thankful that we have wonderful Pat Paynes and wonderful Dr. Joseph Tucker Edmonds and people who take the time to teach. And we, as educators, I remember one of my most favorite professors when I was getting my education degree was Dr. Jacqueline Blackwell. And she literally gave me a book, well, all of the students, it was called White Teacher. And it was important that she start that courageous conversation and begin that so that people are no longer having white fragility. They're no longer being defensive. They're no longer looking at throwing up defenses, but rather open-minded on how they can full force address these situations, because failure is not an option. As Dr. Flores said, she inherited a legacy of outstanding schools with outstanding achievement and graduation levels, and she knew she had to be the gatekeeper to make sure that that continued. So there shouldn't be disparities in districts across Marion County where the graduation rates are different. So we have to look as educators, look around your classroom. Are the things on your walls representing the students that are in your room? Are the books you're asking the students to read books that represent their culture? There's so many things you have to look at and analyze and do better.
Thank you. I see some comments because I'm going to get to you, Dr. Flora. I want to open up to other folks on the panel because I want to be clear. Are we saying that African-American students' performance has been dampened, has been negatively impacted because of racism?
Absolutely.
And we can, and so, and if that is the case, what do we do? You know what I'm saying? How do we move forward? Now I'm going to, and Pat, we're going to come right back to you in a minute in the next question, but I want to open up from our panelists because I want us to be clear that we've seen these negative outcomes. We're not just talking about anecdotal data, right? We can talk about lower graduation rates. We can talk about higher suspension and expulsion. We can talk about lower test scores, right? And I want us to be clear that this is a direct result of that, of systematic and structural racism. Dr. Flora and Marshawn, did you have a 1 minute rebuttal?
Yeah, I do. And I think what we need to do as educators is we got to go so much deeper than that. We have to truly understand that the system itself was created for a white middle class. So if we don't pay attention to that, then we're going to continuously lose our focus. Yeah. And so all of the things that we, especially white middle class teachers, which make up the majority of the teaching staff in the United States, if we don't pay attention to that and really understand the roots of that, we will never be able to dismantle it because we're not recognizing it. And so it's uncomfortable conversations because sometimes we as white people, we don't even realize that the system was built inherently against people of color.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, I would echo what the superintendent said and point to a couple of examples. The NAACP has led on lead and the fact that lead is right. How is it that only 3 school districts really responded and reacted to that? It's that kind of indifference that is problematic for me. At least that's my understanding. Another example might be, when the AAC, the African American Coalition of Indianapolis, when we look at education, and I might be stealing my own thunder, we are connecting it to economic development. We're connecting it to homicides. We're connected it to food deserts. We're connected it to trauma, housing, and all these other different systems that come into play that undermine the experience of the child in the classroom. So for us, our position is, how can you possibly be engaging on trying to deal with the racial achievement gap if you're not reaching out and talking about, well, housing, lead, crime, violence, trauma, all these other things. And so that's been kind of like our entrance into this. The fact that even the mayor, we need the mayor to talk about the racial achievement gap because that has a fundamental impact on the future of the city. From my perspective, public safety isn't the first job, it's taking care of children. If you take care of children, you'll be safe, you'll have an economic environment that'll be for the future. And so I'll stop there so that you can keep moving.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Marshawn and Dr. Flora. But I want to keep moving because this is exactly what we're talking. We're talking about a larger, like a large frame, right? But and I want us to go both wide and narrow because I'm going to narrow in for a minute. And this is about the fact, I think, Dr. Flora, you said this, Heather, you said this, Pat, Dr. Payne, you said this as well, that 77% of teachers in the United States are white women. 77% of teachers in the United States are white women. In Indiana, we have 93% of our teachers are white, and some a huge number are also white women. And so we're saying if we are going to address this, right, we've also got to go broad and say, like, how is our school system set up for white middle class subjects, right, in some ways, but also that those subjects are the leaders at the front of the classroom too, as well, right? And so I wanted to kind of come back to Terrell and to Pat Payne. I wanted to ask both of you all, you know, one of the interventions that we've been doing in the last 25, 35 years is we've said, okay, we know we've got this problem. We have a disproportionate amount of white female teachers in the classroom trying to teach and to provide and to close this racial gap. And the way that we're going to respond to it is we're going to have a few sessions of cultural competency training, right? From the Board of Ed, from your school. And I want us to ask or to think about, both Terrell and Ms. Payne, what is the value of cultural competency trainings, first of all? And, you know, are a few enough, or is that a good start, or how can we move beyond that, or what do we need to do to move from that model that we currently find ourselves under to a model where we can actually see some transformation? So,
Terrell, I'll let you go first.
Okay. Well, the first thing I'll say is, you know, I think that anytime you speak about competency, it's about, you know, until you do something successfully. So I think you do it until you're successful at it. One of the biggest frustrations that I had, you know, from my seat at the department is I'll get the conversation started, but I can't lead you on. So I think that what makes people uncomfortable is the conversation itself. I think if you look at, and again, I'll speak from my seat, state level data, we as a state have failed minority kids since 1954, I'll say. And I think, you know, a couple of different factors played into that. But anytime you're speaking about competency is you do it until you're successful at it. And we as a state are not successful at it at all. So I think that, you know, Dr. Flores said earlier, is just that kind of one-stop shop mentality that we had. We're really good at checking the box. And so one of the things that we've done at the department is, you know, every school does a school improvement plan. We've embedded cultural competency inside the school improvement plan. But if we talk about the bigger picture is we don't have any teeth in that. You know, so from my seat, again, I've been doing this 2.5, 3 years, just in terms of anything cultural competency from the department. I can't make a school reach out to me. You know, and so I think that my biggest fear right now is people are going to capitalize on the moment. Let's do a training and we're good. We're competent now. And, you know, the same way we as educators speak about being lifelong learners, that exact same thing applies to competency. And so there isn't like a finish line when you talk about competency. So I think we need to change the way in which we talk about that and the way in which we think about that. Competency is continuous. And so I think also schools need to take that work on themselves. You know, I've been saying every school needs an equity director. Every building needs someone in terms of equity. And it doesn't just have to be the Black person in the building, which is by default what it ends up being. But every district in the entire state needs someone just speaking about equity for your district. And I think that that's kind of the beginning of the conversation, but it continues on and goes much deeper than that.
Mm-hmm. That's one of the blessings that I have with being with the Indianapolis Public Schools. That is all that I concentrate on is equity. But a training session is nothing without the follow-up. We don't just do those 2-day racial equity trainings and then send them out to go right back and do exactly what they always have been doing. First of all, if you're going to do this right, it takes a major shift in your knowledge. You have to relearn everything. A major shift in your knowledge, a major shift in your attitude, in your mindset, in your belief system. That belief system is corrupted, totally corrupted. And so that means you've got to dig deep to see what is in there that can be purged. Sometimes it can be merged with new information, but most times you just got to purge it and start over. And that's a very hard thing to do when you think about how those belief systems were formed. But you've got to do that if you're going to be teaching children. And this isn't just good for Black children. White children need to learn the truth too, so that they can learn up, to grow up and understand the truth. After they get those belief systems purged, then they've got to pay attention to their practice. And another thing I might say is, it's not just, the majority of our teachers are white and have a completely different experience than our children. But there are some Black teachers also that may do harm to our children because it's called internalizing racism. When you internalize that garbage that comes at us all the time through the media, through the person you're standing next to, I mean, this is nothing to play with, because it's in the air. We're breathing it right now as we speak. It's like smog, it's everywhere. And so we've got to look at that. When we have our 2-day trainings, we have a district equity team that we pair with the school equity teams, because we want to make sure that after they go through those trainings, they are still holding the work together in the school. So we make sure that, first of all, they're disaggregating their data. If you don't look at disaggregated data, you will never be able to see that it's Black children that are always at the bottom. And not only see that, you got to question why Black children are always at the bottom. They come out of their mama's womb as geniuses, but the farther along they are in school, they get dumbed down, dumbed down, dumbed down. We have reading books, we have study books, we have study guides. After the workshop, everybody gets a workbook, but we also have lists of readings that they have to continue to do. So it's not just 2 days training and go back. There's a lot of different things that have to continue to go on throughout the school year. And that's why it's so important that we make principals feel comfortable having conversations about race and racism. Before this year, I never had the opportunity to speak to principals. I'm in every principals meeting now, talking with them. We're using Paul Gorski's case study book. It's excellent, and it helps people get into conversations about race and racism, because they've got to go back to those schools and lead these conversations. And it keeps going on and on and on. No, just the training will not. In fact, sometimes the training makes things worse if you don't have things to follow up and make sure that that work is being held together.
Yeah. Thank you both. I want to kind of ask a follow up for for Pat and for Terrell, just to say, where have you seen the greatest moments of success in terms of, I know, Pat, you've done so much training throughout so many years. When have you seen the greatest impact? And for Terrell, I wanted to ask again, I know you've done some of the racial bias training around the state. What are the examples or models of success that you would say we need to double down on, that we need to invest more in? And then I want to open up to the other panelists if they have a minute or two of comments that they want to make in response to y'all. I also want Pat and Terrell and Flora and Mashawn and everybody, I hope y'all are reading the chat, because I know y'all can't hear the audience, but they are like, it's the whole choir and amen. They saying preach. They are feeling y'all out there in Zoom world. So I want to let y'all know, even though we can't hear everybody, that people are engaged and listening and responding and asking questions. So where have you all seen success? And then I'm going to move to our other panelists if anybody wants to jump in with a minute rebuttal.
It has a lot to do with leadership, a lot to do with with leadership at the building level, of course, but also leadership from the top. This, for so many years, it was always anything that came dealing with culture or history or cultural competence, it always came from Pat Payne and Anne Marie Byers, you know. Mm-hmm. And all this time, what we were mainly doing is what I call food, fashion, and festivals. Okay? Now we are into the nitty gritty of what it's going to take for change. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't have those things, but in addition to that, you've got to have what we are doing now, true racial equity, and a leader at the top. It should not be from the bottom up. It needs to be from the top down, and then it spreads out to everybody. And that's what I think. And I'm not saying we haven't had leaders before in IPS, but I'm seeing some different things happening now that have never happened before. And it's not easy for a leader at the top to do some of the things that I see going on now. But I think leadership is very, very important.
So I definitely echo that. I think some of the best thing that I've seen is when schools, I really try to force schools to rethink about what the purpose of a school is. If you're not serving your community, then what are you there for? So I think that one of the biggest disconnects that we have oftentimes in schools is we operate in silos. I think that we need to shift our focus to a piece of shared responsibility between us and the community that we serve. So as I've been around the state, some of the best examples that I've seen I've been brought in by a superintendent, assistant superintendent, but in that meeting you had members of the community, that was parents, and that wasn't just your PTO, rah-rah, stand-up parents. I mean, you had parents of some of your students in alternative schools. So I think that one of the best examples is reshifting our focus and kind of that mind shift to say, we're here to serve our community. And what that means is, when you talk about your handbook, parents are looking at your behavioral policy and having some say so, because if I'm a parent, you suspend my kid and I can't go to work, that doesn't do me any good. So what's the medium? So I think that rethinking the way we even conduct school and really serving your community, that's where I've seen schools begin to have the most success. But also it's in that, you know, what Pat said, me talking to a room full of central office. These aren't even people in their buildings. Just having those conversations. I think a lot of times we only focus on who's in front of our kids, and it's a lot deeper than that. And I think that we all understand that. But I think, you know, some of the districts that I've worked with that reshift their focus and really serve their community. And that means, I mean, changing the way you do everything. You know, how many schools have done parent-teacher conferences at the local park, you know, and that's just changing the expectation. And so I think that where I've seen it be the most successful is those places where you really work on that shared responsibility and parents are having some say so in your school policy. And so I think that's where I've seen districts have the most success so far.
It's where parents are welcomed and not judged. Mm-hmm. Where parents are welcomed and not judged when they come through that door.
Yeah. I want to open up to the other panelists. If anybody had 1 minute.
Oh, I think they just built these not too long ago.
I'm going to ask everybody to mute for a minute. I'm going to open up to the panelists to see if they have any 1 minute responses or.
I do.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Dr. Flora.
The things that I have found just through my work with equity over the years is that one of the best places to start with is really with ourselves and really understand our own identity, recognizing our own bias, and really understanding how power and privilege has worked through years and years, centuries. And so when we start first internally, before we could start digging in deeper to really understand, we can go so much farther in the conversation. And it's uncomfortable. But we also have to recognize that sometimes those uncomfortable conversations are the ones that will make the biggest difference when we are responsible for the lives of children.
Yeah. Jill, I saw you unmuted. Do you have something you want to add?
Yeah, in addition to support what the other panelists are saying, we generally spend our time and money on what we value.
Yes.
And there needs to be two-way accountability because, as Terrell said, we kind of get it skewed in terms of who we're serving and who we're accountable to. If the children and the parents don't know what we're doing to hold us accountable, then we're really not checking ourselves if they can't check us. So this needs to be a twofold approach. In addition to that, you know, I'm always very leery of even the term cultural competency. I can't be competent in what it is to be a man. I can have as much understanding, but I can't be competent in that as a woman. So I'm very in tune with why that originated, when America started looking at cultural competency, and that the dominant culture is never part of the conversation, which is part of the problem. So it becomes an other. When we're talking about cultural competency, the mindset goes to, we're talking about children of color, but we never examine the white race and what white is and why we have the situations that we do. So if we're going to have conversations that include cultural sharing, we need to always make sure we're understanding white culture as well.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point, because I mean, and that jumps right into going back to Jill and Dr. Valerie. I wanted to bring you all in, because the topic that the next question that we posed was really thinking about the trauma that is experienced by our students and their families every time they walk into the building, right? But also the trauma that they experience every time they inhabit the larger world that we live in, right? That the school system or the school building is just another reflection of the larger society that we live in, right? That when we're talking about issues with police brutality, we have those similar police logics or practices in our school buildings, right? The way in which young Black and brown students are handled or mishandled by public safety officers in school buildings, the ways in which they are disciplined or treated as they walk around school grounds. I really want us to think about how that plays out in many ways. So I want to ask you, how do you see, or how do we need to deal with cultural trauma and mental health services as we respond to this larger set of issues and questions that we are addressing this evening? Like, can you unpack that for us a little bit? What, you know, how are cultural trauma and systemic racism connected, if you will? But then how do we respond to it in the classroom, or how do we mitigate it in the classroom, if we can?
That question is for me, I'm supposing, right?
Yeah, Valerie and Jill, can y'all both jump in on that?
Okay, we both jump in. Let's talk about, I like to talk about the little traumas. You know, everybody knows what it feels like to come into a meeting late. You don't know what you've missed. You don't know what question you can ask. You don't let and steal. We let our children get sent home from school, and they come back with that same sense of anxiety. They don't know what they've missed. They don't know where to raise their hands. They don't know what's been talked about. So what they do is act up, and they get thrown out of school even more. By the time this goes on, they've trained us on how to send them home. I think that if we were to start anywhere, we should start there. That sending children home, suspending kids needs to stop. There's no reason for it right now, because we don't know how to integrate them back. It would be different if the parents understood what the homework was. But what happens is that it's not the curriculum that's the problem, so that the parents cannot teach their children when they're home. They can't teach them how they learned how to read, because they didn't learn to read phonetically like their parents learned to read. So those are little traumas. The trauma of coming back into a school and not knowing what's going on. And to tell you how important that is, when I work in prisons, because I work in prisons with high school kids and kids, I worked at boys' schools. I work in adult prisons that have kids in them, and they always wind up on my caseload because I enjoy them. But one of the things that I've learned, I was one young man, he was, you know, I couldn't get to go to school. I could not get him to go get his GED. And I said, well, wait a minute, how many times have you been shot? Oh, I've been shot about 9 times. I mean, how many people have you shot? Well, what they said was, okay, so you've been shot 9 times, you've been in front of the police officer, you've been in front of the courts this many times, you've almost died. But what you're telling me is that going in front of a classroom and worried about being called on and not having the answer is scarier for you than getting shot and being shot at. And he said, you're right, exactly. I'd rather get shot than to worry about going into a classroom and somebody ask me something I don't know because I've missed school. You see what I'm saying? So that's traumatizing. That missing school is traumatizing. When we're dealing with trauma in kids, trauma-informed care, you have to be very cognizant of the fact that kids have been traumatized, but the answer to that is not necessarily to coddle them. It's not necessarily important to make their situations easier. If anything, we're going to push that child a little bit harder, give them a skill that they didn't know, give them a little insight on something a little bit harder than what they're used to. Because what they need to have is a sense of competence, even in the midst of trauma. And so what they need is fair, firm, and consistency across the board. And when I look at our children, I look at them as Maseratis. And if you drive them slow, they're going to look like crap. They're going to look like Ford Escapes or whatever. You know, they're going to look bad because they're driven so slow, right? A Maserati has to be ran faster. So my thing is, when a kid is struggling with a lot of trauma, it is not the time to make their road easier. Their road needs to be firm, fair, and consistent, because you're the road to their healing. They need to know that that teacher is going to push them, is going to expect some things for them that they can't be expected to do in any other circumstances. And they can rise to that occasion. Trust me, they can rise to those occasions.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Let me go over to Jill. If you can kind of expand and continue in that regard.
Absolutely. As Valerie indicated, when we have fair and consistent, equitable treatment of our children, first of all, coming into a building has been traumatizing for me. I've gone to schools in the state of Indiana that you think, I mean, it's like a 50-year time capsule where, you know, bathrooms don't work, the lighting is dim, their furniture is the yellow and green and brown straight out of the 70s. So we talk about inequities in terms of what our children are getting. And then I've walked in schools that the physicality is nice, but I'm traumatized walking down the hall and seeing nothing but old white men's faces, and then Obama. And that's the representation that you see throughout the entire school in terms of, you need to see what you can be. And if we're only celebrating one culture, not only in our textbooks, not only in the educators that we see, but also from the visuals on the walls, except for the 1 month that we give African Americans. And we know even from the representation of Pike Township, we have a huge Burmese population, we have Latin American, and even if you're in a community that is all white, we need to still celebrate that we're not the center of the universe, and learn to value humanity and creativity in all human beings. So that in and of itself is traumatizing. We have the outside world. We happen to be in a perfect storm where COVID had us sitting still and we had to pay attention. But George Floyd wasn't the first person that we saw choked out. But we expect our children to come to school the next day after seeing that repeatedly, not only in their communities, but nationwide television, social media, and perform, for lack of a better word, without any, exactly, Trajan Reed, without any connection to what's going on in their lives or validating who they are as human beings. So we create trauma repeatedly for our children and then say, but sit there, be quiet, plug into the matrix. Some of us are the walking dead, and we're trying to bring them along with us. And the behaviors that we see are truly because they are trying to live and exist, and we're trying to say, no, don't be you. Come into, we're trying to put squares into circles. So we need to approach this from a community aspect. Who in the community that relates to these children are working with the children? We used to have communities where there was a connection to the people servicing the children. We also need to make sure that those working with the students reflect the students. We need to have equity in that. And there is not finding those individuals. Pike High School graduates a lot of them. So what are we not, what are we missing where we're connecting those dots? We need to see a child as a whole and not a piece of a child. You know, I worked with counselors and therapists for years where I would say, well, what's your recommendation based on the family? Well, I don't know the family. Well, they have 4 siblings. What about the connection to the siblings? Well, I'm not the therapist for the siblings, but are you not taking that in consideration when you're making these recommendations for these children? And the language we use, which excuses some for their behaviors when we're trying to be consistent with our expectations and saying things like microaggression. No, an aggression is an aggression. So let's put that where it is and stop softening things. You say that for that child, but this child over here doesn't get to say that's a microaggression, because now we're getting into our groundwater of implicit biases. So we need to check ourselves and our environment when we're welcoming students in to do what? Again, are we walking dead and we want them to walk alongside of us, or are we creating human beings to be the best that they can be based on their circumstances? So we have to check ourselves. There was a study a few years ago that I read. Now I can't remember where I found it, but it actually looked at students as a whole with disparate punishments. And when there was no subjectivity, when it was, if you bring a knife to school, if you bring a gun to school, it's expulsion, no questions asked. The disparities for children of color, specifically Black boys, came in when teachers had discretion. That's when brown and Black children are always punished more. So here we go back to this trauma. And what's the largest growing population of those that are suspended or expelled? Preschool and kindergarten Black boys. And what's the biggest predictor of future expulsions? Current expulsion. So then we create this wheel, and by 10th grade, we don't understand what happened, but we have those who can't deal with a 5- and 6-year-old.
Exactly.
That's right. I'm amen in everything. Can you hear me? I'm just amen in everything you're saying, Jill. And you're right. What you said last when they had this study, I think it was the civil rights study. It was about 4 or 5 years ago where it talked about the expulsions of kindergarten, Black kindergarten children. Come on. Yes. What was it? Oh, I thought I heard somebody mention that. So, failure to comply. That's one of the things that they use to put our children out. That's and that means if you just look at the teacher wrong, that's the reason for you to be put out and put in one of those holding cells in the schools. That's exactly what I call them. Somebody said something else that I just wanted to, it was, children will bend to meet your low expectations, just like they will rise to meet your high expectations. Absolutely. It never fails.
Absolutely.
I want to get back, because I want to shift to the next question, because I want to get to this final question that I have, and then open up for everyone, because I wanted to ask, what are the policy interventions that we need to have in place right now? Because again, these are policy realities that can be shifted if we are willing, by our budgets, by our will, by our protest, to push forward things that we know can actually create spaces for higher expectations, create demands for greater accountability, and those kinds of things. So I wanted to bring Marshawn into the conversation. I wanted to ask you, what, and then I want to bring everyone else back in, because I know we're running out of time, but Jill and Valerie, I wanted to ask, are we spending money on these kind of cultural, on these trauma or mental health services, or are we not? But let me bring Marshawn in, and then we'll come back to you all to rebut Marshawn. What are the policy changes that are needed to dismantle systemic racism in our school systems?
So first, what I want to do is privilege educators in that kind of conversation on policy. So I'm an economist. I got an MBA, I got an MPA, but I don't have an education degree. So I want to start there. The way the AACI approached this issue, we looked at the data, and looking at iLearn, iStep, I+, it doesn't matter. 70 to 80% of Black children failed the test from 3rd through 8th grade, and then also 10th grade. Yeah. We have schools where no student passed the test, and we force these kids to go to these schools for 180 days or whatever, and we make them sit there. And that's the result that we get. Now, you can't just stop at that one data point. You got to look at, okay, who's participating in your IB programs? Who's participating in your honors programs? What kind of degrees are people getting if they graduate? What's the sports? And so that's how we began our process. At the same time, we were looking at home ownership rates. We were looking at the fact that even when you graduate with a college degree, as a Black person, a white person with a high school diploma might still have a higher unemployment rate with you, might even make a little bit more money, just depending on the situation. And so when we step back and we're looking at policy solutions, I know that educators will come up with things that are happening, that can happen inside of the classroom. The last policy battle that we were involved with involved classroom management and the necessity for best practices to be a part of that if you're going to do anything with classroom management. But the basic things that we were looking for was, when we looked at every single county, every single township, there was no plan for racial achievement gaps on their websites when we looked. Now, IPS had something about IPS had something about a racial equity plan, and so they counted. But when we looked at all the other townships, we didn't see anything that said racial achievement gap, we're working on it. Now, we assumed folks were doing stuff, but that was a problem for us right there. The other thing was the data. And so if, as a parent, you're thinking about, okay, well, I'm going to take my child to school, I'm actually a proud Pike parent, that matters. And so beyond like legislation and going to the State House, I want to see your plan on the website. I need to see that. I need to understand what it is you're doing, where you are on your plan. Do that for me. I just need to see that. The other piece that the AACI said was, when you're looking at this data, there is so much more that's happening to a child outside of the classroom that impacts what's going on inside of the classroom. And so we wanted the townships and the school boards to make that argument. And so we made that argument ourselves. And so I think one of the other things that we want to see is a robust community conversation about what high quality education looks like, what that means. It might mean different things for different people, but that's some of the things that we want to see from a transparency perspective. I appreciate that Pike has been more public recently. A couple of other schools have been more public as well. The other thing that we have actually advocated for and actually gotten was philanthropic dollars to support schools and to support them on, the food desert issue, the trauma-informed care and financial literacy and things of that nature. So we didn't just come out and just blast folks. We actually worked on issues to actually support the school. And so we're hopeful that the superintendents will embrace on that. I also have to mention charter schools. Right now, we think that charter schools you come up with a plan and they'll just give you one. We want there to be a rational process for deciding, what you're going to do with a charter school. There needs to be a reason. It needs to be responding to market conditions, and it just can't be this willy-nilly. Anytime you want a charter school and you can figure out how to get your application passed, you get a charter school. Our kids deserve more. And when we're thinking about this issue, we're thinking about it through all of the systemic ramifications. And that's why we developed a Black agenda. That's why we did a survey on our Black agenda. And I can tell you right now that education is actually the #1 issue that people are concerned about on our current agenda, and that mental health will be the next thing. So you'll be hearing more from the AACI. I'll just leave it at that.
All right, Marshawn, thank you. That was great. I want to do a quick round with everyone to just tell me, like, if you had to talk about one immediate policy intervention, right? And especially in your area of expertise. So, Dr. Floor with superintendents, cultural competency, school improvement plans, trauma, teacher classrooms or principals. What would that policy be? That's the first thing. And then I'm going to come back because I'm seeing a lot of questions and we're about to come to the questions. Thank you all for being so patient, for listening, for engaging. The questions are like crazy. I'm just telling y'all right now, like it's like 1,000 questions. We will not get through all the questions tonight, but they are so many good questions. But one of the questions I keep hearing over and over again, or one that I'm seeing on the list is, where do folks go on this call, on this Zoom meeting, on the Facebook right now to find the resources that you all are talking about? They're saying, I've had, where the reading list? Where is is there cultural competency training or videos that they can look at while we're at home online? When is the next, webinar that you all are promoting or engaging? But first, before we get to that, think about, those are the two questions. First, quick round of what is the one policy thing that we need to be working on right now from your area of expertise? And I'm just going to start with Dr. Flora. We're going to go to Heather, and then we're going to work our way through, okay? So Dr. Flora, go.
All right, you only gave me one, so I'm going to give you what pops to my head first. And it really is an issue that is statewide, and it's how we determine who is a graduate in the state of Indiana of high school. It is a significant problem. It's one that I've been fighting here in Pike Township for the last year. Specifically, the graduation rate does not recognize students who complete a high school diploma through, for example, Job Corps and different groups, that in the end, a student still has that diploma in their hand, but on paper is considered a non-graduate of Pike High School. It just burns me to the core that this systemic racism is happening in the way that graduation rates are determined. And so, and what happens is it's hidden in layers and layers and layers of bureaucracy. I could just go on, it just burns me to the core.
Yeah, all right, no, thank you. So, okay, all right, we got the how we determine the graduate. All right, we're gonna go to Heather, and then Pat, and then Terrell, then Valerie, then Jill. And then I'm gonna come back to IPS to where we can get some resources, but I wanted to talk about IPS's statement. Dr. Pat Payne, you talked about that.
Well, come to me last then.
Okay, I'll come to you last, Pat. So, okay, Heather, go ahead.
I am very passionate about the fact that there needs to be equitable resources. So I think it's great that, Dr. Pat Payne leads the equity office for IPS, and Dr. Flores with the Equity Council at Pike, but other school districts, if they don't have one, they need one. If they have got to disaggregate their data and find out where they are inequity in their own districts. I literally confronted a school district and told them they were failing their students of color, and they didn't do anything to address it. That is unacceptable. So policies that need to be in place, that can start from the Department of Education, calling upon these superintendents who are turning the other cheek to stop turning the other cheek and do something about it. As far as educator training, it is very important that all these teachers are in the Zoom group chat asking for resources. The historicjourney.org is an excellent resource, and I highly recommend teachers realize history does not start with the transatlantic slave trade. They need to go all the way back, and it's very important that teachers take this time while they have been quarantined to educate themselves as much as they can so that they are culturally conscious. They might not be able to be competent, as some people have said in this conversation tonight, but better, do better.
Terrell, we're going to come to you, and then Valerie, and then Jill, and then Pat.
So I'll say I think the biggest issue is we need to take a serious look at school funding and the school funding formula. And we need to stop taking money from low-income schools that need them and stop giving more money to high-income schools that may not necessarily need it. I mean, I think that that's where you start. The second piece is from my seat. I think that at the department, again, we don't have a cultural competency or equity position at all at the Department of Education. That work is there because I'm there, and that work, if I leave, who continues that work? So I think, one, we need to have I think our governor and legislation needs to have a serious conversation to look at how school is funded, because I think if you see the list, that's problematic extremely. If you see what schools and what districts get the most money and what schools and most districts don't get any money at all necessarily. So I think we need to start there. The second piece, in teachers, I think that any educator that is gaining a teaching license needs to have a course in some form of cultural competency. As of right now, that's not required. And so I think that those are very obvious no-brainer things that can be done. Why they're not done, I can tell you why they're not done, but that's a different conversation. But I think that that's fundamentally where we need to start: school funding and educator licensing.
All right. So
I piggyback on that.
Somebody's keeping the record. You said you want to add, Heather?
Yes, sir. So the School of Education that I went to did have 2 courses that I was required to take. But if you compare apples to apples, the schools of psychology and social work and schools of nursing sometimes do a much better job of culturally training nurses and social workers than the courses for educators. So schools of education definitely need to look at this and tap into where they can improve.
Valerie, policy, and I want to come back to Valerie and Jill. When you guys are updating on the policy, is there enough money set aside for trauma-informed, trauma counseling, trauma, mental health, and mental wellness in our school systems? But talk to me about your policy intervention, but also let the people know: are we doing enough about the trauma that you all so eloquently talked about? How do we what's the response been, or what is it looking like on the ground?
Well, I think that one, it's not a 1 or 2 training session thing. I think a lot of it has to do with having teachers that are from the communities that they're talking about. The main thing, if there's one policy, I don't want to pass without just reiterating that if there's one policy I would change, and that's suspension of kids. I would change that policy. But as far as trauma-informed care, that has to go into every curriculum, mainly because a child that's traumatized is going to look like an ADHD child. And so if you think, if you're trying to solve this issue with Ritalin or with Adderall, when what's happening is that this child is traumatized because they look the same. They can't sit still. They're arguing, they're fussing, they're fighting, they look the same. They pick on other children. So a lot of times we miss the cues as far as which children are traumatized and which children aren't. And some kids will go into themselves and you will never know how much trauma they're going through. So our teachers should be trained in some basic understanding of what trauma looks like and sort of being able to identify it, how to address it. So that would be my goal. That would be a goal.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I would say it's twofold for me. One is that we need to actually integrate culture into everyday curriculum to be respective of more than the dominant culture, which is why and how our Eurocentric curriculum is right now. Until we do that, we are always going to have children re-traumatized by just being left out of the narrative, not realizing their greatness, not seeing themselves reflected, and a population also in terms of feeling entitled and not realizing the truth behind the lie that is right, that we actually put in textbooks and feed our children on as a daily diet. And also that whatever policies are created, that unless we're listening to the children, we're always going to miss out on something. Because if we don't give children credit for having a voice as to what they need, and if we had them included in the conversations, we would have a different narrative in terms of how they want to show up and what is supposed to be their school environment, as opposed to what we, who are disconnected from this generation who's grown up completely different than most of us, how are we to dictate to them what they know they need, but we refuse to listen to? There have been a lot of well-intended policies with a lot of people missing at the table, while one set of people own the table, and we continue to wonder why we have the same results. So if we can do those two things, we would also get further along, in my opinion.
Thank you. I'm going to Pat, because I wanted to get us back to this new policy. We have a new statement out, right? From the IPS board. The what is it, the 1619 resolution, or their Black Lives Matter resolution that they. And I want to talk about what does this mean for us, and how can we operationalize a broad-based statement like this to actually move and impact real change and transformation in our system, right? Because this is a big statement. This is a broad one. How do you read this, Marshawn? I want to ask someone like that, from the business community. How do y'all read this and say, what are we going to do with this statement? But let's start with Pat, and then we're going to go to Marshawn.
I want Marshawn to go back on the IPS website, because this was just approved on Thursday, the racial equity policy and the Black Lives Matter resolution. I couldn't believe it myself. When you see this, it is, and we don't plan on letting these words stay on the page. That's what we're about, making sure this comes alive. Restructuring the IPS Police Department. I'm just reading you the first sentence. It's got stuff under that. Approving a supplier diversity policy. School equity teams, prioritizing the recruitment and retention of Black teachers and school leaders. Creating a unified enrollment structure to promote transparency and equitable access, because we got a lot going on in this district we got to work on. We got schools, well, I won't even go into that, but that's what this addresses, and more and more. So please go on the website and look at this. Please know, I don't know how long I'm going to be around. It can't be that much longer, but I'm going to stay as long as I can with the group that I'm working with. It's not just me. There are others working with this district equity team, and we mean business. We aren't going to just have these words sitting in the policy. And I wanted to invite everybody. IPS will be doing their third IPS Presents. This topic will be, how do you talk about race with children? So that's going to be on July the 10th from 12 to 1, I believe. Go on the IPS website. There's also a lot of resources and books there that we gave them to put on the website. So we welcome you to, that's why they're there, so the community can use them. Please do that. We also have a museum too, but it's not open right now.
Yeah. And I want everyone in, or all of our panelists, if you all want to post your websites down in the chat so that folks can find out where you are, that would be great. I saw that Anne-Marie Beyer, she's been posting some links for us as we go along. Pat Payne, well, Carol Craig was just saying that we do need to have students on this panel, and I know the greater Indianapolis branch of the NAACP, they're just pinging me, telling me that we're going to do another version of this session, or to include different interest groups. But I want to get back. I want to hear. I want everybody, if you all can put your links down there for folks to be able to follow. There are over 200 people on this call right now that are listening in. Do that for folks so they can find that in the chat. But I want to go to Marshawn, and I want to go to Dr. Flora, because I want to hear, how does the business community read this Black Lives Matter, equity resolution? But also I want to hear, Dr. Flora, the light shining on Pike. What's going to happen next? What are the rest of the superintendents throughout the state of Indianapolis, throughout the state of Indiana, and throughout Marion County? Are they going to adopt similar resolutions? Do we think that these resolutions are necessary? So Marshawn, we're going to start with you, and then we're going to get to Dr. Flora.
So here's how I think about it, just as a stratification economist. There's a $22,000 gap between Black family median income and white family median income. Black families are making around $39,000. That's the median. And so white families are making around $17,000. Indiana is one of 14 states that had a Black unemployment rate that was more than double its white unemployment rate.
Wow.
Black housing, the Black home ownership rate is only around 33%. 66% of folks are renting, and you're dealing with a majority of the Black community facing rent burden, which means that they're paying more than 30% of their income on rent. Also, this year, I mentioned the idea of Black Indianapolis being about 238,000 people. In 2018, we had over 100 Black males murdered. That same year, Fort Wayne, which only has about 30,000 more people, had 19 people murdered. I just said over 100 Black males murdered. That's just Black males compared to Fort Wayne's all of 19. So when I think about that statement, it is nice. It is good to have that statement. But what I have to do is look at what's going to happen over time.
That's right.
I'm tired of seeing valedictorians graduate from some of these schools and they can't really get into college. because they weren't ever really pushed. I'm tired of us dying in the streets. We've had Black people, 5 Black people under the age of 18 murdered in this city this year, and it's only June. So on the outset, I appreciate that IPS did this, that they said 1619 and that Black Lives Matter and that they're taking a leadership position on this. I can go to their website and I can point to it and I can say, all right, so they said they're going to do this, let's figure it out. And if somebody puts their stuff out there, it's fundamentally different for me to see that you have a plan and maybe you missed something. That's different, because then I can come and say, well, what happened? Maybe I can help. But if I don't even see a plan, then that just makes me angry, because I know what's happening to my community. I know that we live in food deserts. I know that what's going on to the future of my community. So that's how I'm thinking about this as an economist. As far as the business community, we're going to challenge them. We're going to push them. I don't know how they're going to look at it. But I do think there's an opportunity for superintendents and school boards to reach out to the business community and engage them. I think they have to do that, because you can't just rely on the things that you're going to try to do inside of that 8 hours that you have with students to mitigate all the other things that are happening once that child goes home. And so you have to have that. And so that's the kind of leadership I'll be looking for from school boards and superintendents as it relates to these kinds of things.
All right, Dr. Flora, I want to jump in. Then I'm going to ask some questions from the group and from the Facebook and from Zoom in a minute. But I'm going to I want you to talk about other superintendents. And I know the next conversation that we want to have, that the NAACP is planning, the next forum, is wanting to bring together superintendents throughout the state, wanting to kind of put some real heat to their feet and say, let's have these courageous conversations. Let's talk about this now while we're here. Let's plan for September 1. Because I mean, we haven't even talked about the racial inequities, the systemic inequities that are coming from online learning from this last spring. And that's a whole nother conversation, and the trauma of that's experience of the death and early and premature death that our young children are watching, both from COVID-19 and from Black Lives Matter in the streets right now, having to explain all of these phenomena. We've got to have a plan. We can't just assume that we're gonna send out a note and say schools will be open on August 17th. Come back and let's start again. But go ahead, Dr. Flora. I'm talking too much. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna kind of go back to the plan part of it. Yeah. Many of you may have seen the Marion County initiative that we've put out, and it's all 11 of the school districts, public school districts in Marion County. We have provided resources. We have made the commitment individually that within our own districts, we're going to examine policies and so forth. And everybody's in a little bit different place. Some have dug really deep for a while. Some are just at the surface still. But it's a conversation that happens when we meet together as superintendents here in Marion County. For us in Pike, through a partnership with the Great Lakes Equity Center, we are actually finalizing our strategic plan that will be announced at the beginning of the school year. We have 3 goals. The first goal really identifies the disproportionate number of our Black males in particular, whose achievement is disproportionate to their peers. The second goal really focuses on access, equitable access to programs. And the third one really is our disproportionate number of suspensions or disciplinary actions based on disruptive behavior. So we are tackling them. We have 3 different committees that are working on it, and we will be working very targeted on those areas, while at the same time providing a significant amount of professional development which is needed, which is why Paul Gorski will be our opening day speaker and come back November to continue that training, as well as building champions in each building, because we got to build capacity. This is not something that a group of people can do alone. We've got to pull it in, and I'm so proud. There are so many Pike people on this today. I'm so proud of each of them because they want to be part of the conversation too.
Thank you so much. I want to, we've been told that we have a few more minutes. I know it's 7:30, everyone. I want to, again, thank everyone for showing up. This is an amazing group. I've loved reading the chat. Like, I'm tired from reading the chat. Like, I'm trying to read the chat, listen to y'all, integrate the questions, learn from y'all, all that kind of stuff. But I wanted to ask, one of the questions that folks are asking, and I think I've seen this like 6 or 7 times. So one thing is, I want you all to put into the chat resources. Folks keep asking, we need resources. What should we be doing from June, whatever today is, June 29th, until we go back into school? What do we need to be reading? What do we need to be working on? What videos do we need to be watching? So please, if you all have any websites or things that you want to highlight, bring that up now. But also, one of the questions that a couple of folks have asked, it says, this is a large and a long transformation process that we are all articulating, right? That we are changing mindsets, that we are dismantling, dethroning, Eurocentric centuries and millennia of oppression. Like, what do we do in day to day? How do we think about affecting change when a teacher on this call goes back into a classroom the first week of August? What is the everyday act or the simple act or the basic act that a teacher on today's call or today's Zoom meeting should be doing when they walk in? Yes, we want to see the large scale transformation and shift, but how do we start right now? I mean, I have that 6 or 7 times, like that people says, what happens to the day-to-day experience? What can we do in the interim? What process can we start right now, right? These are the questions that I'm seeing. So anybody on the panel want to jump in and answer that question?
Privately responded to some people who were asking those questions based on their grade level that they teach, to offer specific resources. Because as an educator, I always feel like books is a great way to start a conversation, and quality literature that addresses racism and specifically is anti-racist is a good starting point. The same person asked how often. As often as it until this goes away. This is funny. I did not think we would be having what's going on today. That's not acceptable, and it has to stop. And we have to do our part to make it stop.
I think the first thing when we get back to school, let's assume that kids go back to school. Let's not act like what happened this summer didn't happen. I think educators do a terrible job of not assuming their students know what's going on in the larger world. And because we may be uncomfortable as adults talking about things, we just act like they never happened and try to go on with Algebra 1 like anybody cares about that when they just saw somebody die on Facebook. So I think that's kind of step number 1, is let's not act like what took place around our nation didn't take place. I mean, I think you have to talk about it. And so I think that every district, every school, every building, come August 7th, their first week of school cannot be your traditional first week of school. It's let's address the elephant in our nation. And every teacher has to, one, be inspired by their building leader to talk about it. I think inspiration has to come from the superintendent, but we have to talk about what's taking place in our world. I think that's kind of step 1.
We're working on a curriculum guide now. We are calling it Amelia's Project. And that's exactly what it is, a curriculum. We're starting with primary school that will help children be able to deal with all the things, this COVID-19 trauma that has happened to them, and discussions and books, so that we can hear about their experiences with this. We want to hear their voice. So we are working on that right now. I also wanted to, I was gonna say, one of the things you can do when you go back into that classroom is make sure you have a welcoming environment for children to come into, so that they can see themselves mirrored on your walls, or they can see a society, a diverse society, but mainly let it mirror who they are, not just in your classroom either. I can walk into a school and tell exactly what's going on in that school just by the pictures and things on the wall.
Yeah.
Okay, you really can. One more thing, I would like to invite you to read the book, Polite Protest. Polite Protest by Richard Pierce. It is the history of racism in Indianapolis. It is powerful. In fact, that's another thing we're doing. I'm leading a study group with the superintendent's leadership team on polite protest. The book we read before that was Ghost in the Schoolyard by Eve Ewing. And that talks about the impact of school closings on the community. So you always got to be reading, but be sure to get Polite Protest.
I want to reiterate what Ms. Pat just said. We actually have a leadership group that uses that book to inform our policy agenda and
That's right.
our approach, because we're not so polite anymore.
Exactly.
At the data, just no time. What I will say though is that I am actually I'm not happy with any of the data that I've seen on any of the school districts as it pertains to Black children from just none of the data. Nevertheless, I am still a proud Pike parent. And if I'm thinking about what I want teachers to do, I want them to prepare for parents. And I need them, like, and I'll just say it, my principal, I think, is actually on here. Her name is Lisa Steele. She knows who I am. She knows who my son is. She knows all about him. And the teachers that I have had, they know my son. They know all kinds of stuff about him. They know about me. And I get to know them. And they get to know me. And part of the reason why that happens is I think the school leader has set up the expectation is that you're going to get to know the parents, and parents come all different kinds of ways. But I think that's one of the main things that teachers can do, in part because you're going to do everything you can in the classroom. But when I get them home, I need to be empowered to know what I need to do, because I know that I'm part of the solution as well.
Right.
And, that's the main thing that I would say.
I would encourage the environments to be conducive to adults as well as the students, because we've got a lot of people that have had deaths in the family, lost jobs.
Yeah, that's true.
We've got these layers of trauma that have been a result of COVID that manifested racism before we had to sit still and pay attention to Officer Lee and the deaths that occurred. So we need to make space for all of that and really be mindful of the environments that we're saying we're trying to create and what they're actually producing. And I have to share this. So my daughter works at Pike. She's the dance coach, and she looks young. And the number of times that she's come home because her jacket has been zipped and educators have approached her asking where she's supposed to be in the building, and the way they've talked to her has been atrocious. And until they see that she's one of their peers and they change their tune, if this is what our students are facing, no wonder they're responding the way they are. She's a young adult and can quickly respond, but all the kids don't have those choices. So we need to create a conducive environment that wasn't there before, that's got layers of what we've been dealing with for the last several months. You're on mute.
Dr. McCray.
Who did you call on?
Okay, am I on mute now?
Oh, Valerie, you're good. You're good.
One of the things that I'm good to go. One of the things that our children are very good at is reading body language. If they can't read it, they can read your body language. They can tell if they're feeling welcomed. They can tell whether you like them. I don't care what you're saying to them. They can feel how you feel about them. And that makes all the difference in the world. You can call that kid any name in the book, but they can tell you that you still love them because of the way something about what you're saying is resonating with them. So it's not the words, it's not being polite, it's not any of that. These kids can feel your love or not. And if you're not loving our kids, you need to go somewhere else. And that's the bottom line. We need to change out these teachers who can't love our children. We need to change them out very rapidly. I grew up at School 37, right next to the Juvenile Detention Center, K through 8, and we felt that love. And so we have that confidence. I had the confidence to run for president of the United States. I'm still running right now because I went to public school. So because I had that love, and that's more important than any of the computers or any of that stuff, the technology. Love that child first. If you can't love them, leave them alone and find another job. That's my thing right now.
Thank you. I mean, I know that we're running out of time, but I want to come back to this question of all of the larger issues that are framing the real structural injustices and traumas that our students and parents and their families face on a day-to-day basis, right? We talked about food deserts, we talked about police brutality, we talked about these higher rates of expulsion and suspension. All of these are working to prevent our students from being their best selves when they walk into any classroom or any school building. And we can't only have a conversation about the classroom, or only have a conversation about the school, because even if the school building were perfect, right, they would still have to walk through neighborhoods and up and down streets where their identity and their real worth was questioned. And so I want to ask, though, what do we say? What are we saying to both parents and to students and to advocates and activists on this call? Like, what should we be engaging and protesting and fighting for right now as well, right? How do we organize? Like, I want us to think about, like, if we're going to dismantle systemic racism, right? If we're going to be anti-racist, if we are going to create a society where everyone can be a success and really thrive and really enjoy the freedoms of our society, we're going to have to act collectively and collaboratively in a number of ways. Like, how do we prepare our students to do that? How do we encourage our families to do that? And where are the spaces and places for us to make that happen? So I wanted to end with that. How do we continue this conversation, but how do we not lose energy and focus? How do we really get people excited so that they can argue and agitate for their well-being? Students, parents, community members, for all of the issues that we discussed today.
One thing that I did as an educator, something was really bothering me. Like, I had created a Black History contest in the month of February, and no one had participated. And when all of the peaceful protests turned into police brutalizing the people protesting police brutality by being shot with tear gas and bullets while they were peacefully protesting, I couldn't sleep that night because I kept analyzing, am I doing everything I can do? Are the people I know and care about doing everything they can do? And I literally sent an email, and I took frameworks of questions and said, look right now around the walls of your home. Does it reflect any other culture than the cultures represented in your house? Look around the readings that you're doing. Does it reflect any other readings than the culture of your home? Before we went into quarantine, did you have any other visitors in your home besides the cultures in your home? So quote unquote uncomfortable conversation, but it was one that for my classroom, I have 33% African Americans, 33% Asian, 15% Latino, and 15% Caucasian. And it was met with very good positive outcome from the parents of my students. And there's other times throughout my teaching, now people are talking about Juneteenth, but I was trying to have that conversation years and years and years before, and I was getting shut down about stuff like that. So, same thing with the Confederate flag. I've been talking about that for years. The high school that I graduated from in Indiana still sees it as, unfortunately, freedom of speech, whereas our counterpart high school in the same city sees it as absolute hatred, and it's unacceptable. So superintendents need to be writing policies, and you know, lots of people have homework to do to stop these things that are absolutely unacceptable.
That's another thing that's in our Black Lives Matter. The district will now celebrate Juneteenth. Now, yes, when you ask that question, what came into my mind was the bodega at Flanner House.
Yes.
Where I want to talk to people, listen to people. I want them to understand why people are poor. Why are people poor? That's one of the things we've started asking in our onboarding process when new people come in, because we want to hear exactly why they think people are poor. I want to know if you take them all the way back to those laws and policies that were intentionally made. And I think it started right around 1619 when we came over here, like the GI Bill, where we'd be over there fighting for our country, but when we came home, we couldn't get home, see? Talk about redlining. I want people to understand why they are in the condition they are in. I use the Monopoly game as an analogy. It doesn't matter if you get the same capital. Used to be $200 when I was coming up. Everybody gets $200. But if you start 5 hours behind everybody else,
right,
what happens when you finally get into the game? We play this with our students also. What happens when you finally get in the game? Everything's gone. All the hotels, everything's gone. So when you land in jail, you're kind of relieved, see? And to me, that's an analogy for Black children in the classroom. When they're ignored, when they're put in the back of the room, when they are not taught, they just withdraw from the process, just like the person that went to jail, see? Because the teacher's already withdrawn from the process as far as that child is concerned, see? Yeah. It is so, so deep.
Yeah, it is. I mean, and this is, again, I mean, I want to thank everyone for joining this conversation. I mean, this is what Ibram Kendi, a lot of folks had said how to be an anti-racist or to read his book Stamped. He also has a young adult version of Stamped that was, I think, written by Jason McReynolds, where for young children who can also read this. But one of the things that he talks about is the interlocking, you know, systems of oppression. That if we're going to be talking about race, we're talking about public health crisis, we're talking about gender, we're talking about sexuality, we're talking about class and poverty. And if we're going to have these conversations, if we're going to really make our classrooms and make every room in our societies amenable to all people, then we're going to have to do some real strategic work of dismantling systems that were never created for everybody to be there, right? And we got to do that. We got to do it together. We got to unlearn old habits. We've got to be courageous in these conversations. We got to continue to show up. And I think that we've got to think out, really think outside the box in the way that we are going to be committed. I mean, I loved Jill and everyone that were talking about, we've got to center this idea that culture is something that we all bring to the table and that we all have to unpack and all need to think through collectively and structurally. I've been getting some notes from NAACP to let everyone know that NAACP is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. We do not endorse or promote any candidate, but we encourage everyone to vote. And that's one of the things I want us to talk about, to end with. We need to vote. We need to show up. We need to engage and to demand for the world that we've all talked about this evening. The policies and the proposals that we all think are necessary. Carol Craig, one of the members of the NAACP Education Committee, said, "We should all be prepared to go to the state board August 12th meeting at 9 a.m. and advocate for revised funding and resources for students with high percentage Black and brown students in their jurisdictions." We've got to hold folks accountable. We got to hold them accountable, and we also got to let them know and demand what we need.
And we've got to look at how vouchers are taking money away from public schools too. We've got to have a discussion on that at some point.
Well, you're exactly right. We've got, you have to complete the census. We've got to vote. We've got to agitate. We've got to really support our children in this regard. And I want to end. I didn't know if anyone wanted to have one last comment. I don't want to be the last word, but if there's one last comment as we're closing out this evening, as we've thought about structural racism, as we've thought about how implicit bias shows up in these unexpected ways and is so difficult to dismantle, as we've talked about cultural competency and responding to the long generations and really the public health crisis of trauma that affects Black and brown children in this state, in this region, and throughout the country. What is the takeaway? What is the message that we want to leave with tonight? We have 170 teachers and parents and administrators on this call right now, on this Zoom room. We have folks on Facebook that have spent 2 hours with us tonight. And maybe one or two of you, what's the takeaway? What's the next step? What gives us hope to keep fighting tomorrow?
I'd like to throw in that because most of the people are on this Zoom related to children in some kind of way, we need to be real about the world we're creating for them and the world we're leaving now.
Yeah.
A lot of us say one thing, but we don't practice it, the inequities of what children have. If we get back to human solidarity and having enough respect for one another, that what is for my child is for your child, as opposed to the individuality that comes out of racism, we could move in ways that we've never moved before. But we have to be willing to organize around the thought that not a moment, but the core question at hand. If I want for you what I want for my child, then we don't stop fighting, whether it's racism, whether it's inequity in education, whether it's in food deserts, whatever it is, we stay together, because what's been lost in racism is our humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And we say it, but we don't live it out. So at what point do we stop caring about everyone else's child and turn our backs and allow children to be slaughtered in the street? So either we're gonna do it or we're gonna serve lips.
Mm-hmm. It's true.
When I look at the data, I spend a lot of time looking at the data and what's going on with Black Indianapolis. And I think about the Black National Anthem. In there's this phrase that goes, "Hope unborn has died." And it's sung. When I consider the reality of hope unborn has died, that is the bleakest possible situation you could imagine. But the elders remind me it is sung because we've been there before and we got out of it. And so on the question of how do you stay hopeful, that's how I stay hopeful. Now, I also believe, you got to advocate, you got to raise your voice, you got to do the things that, that get you towards progress. The long arc of the universe don't bend to justice by itself. You have to be engaged in that. And so the African American Coalition has developed an agenda. We've done a survey to try to ascertain what the priorities should be, what a Black agenda should look like, and some other issues, because we know this won't be the first agenda. This was only the first agenda. It won't be the last agenda. We will be continuing to listen. We've accomplished a number of our policy objectives, but we still know that we got to do so much more. And so that is the work that the African American Coalition will be committed to, which is both continuing to listen, continuing to try to develop the ideas from the community to move us forward and to remain hopeful.
Something is happening out here. Something is happening. When they talk about these Sahara dust storms coming out of Africa, to me, that is the ancestors talking. I'm telling you, something is happening out here. And when that dust storm is blowing over continents, that's the ancestors. So just watch and see what is getting ready to happen. in this world. And I'll just end with this. We will know that we have achieved when student outcomes can no longer be predicted by race or ethnicity.
Come on.
Because that is sure what's happening now. We will know that we have achieved when student outcomes can no longer be predicted by race or ethnicity. The ancestors are watching.
Well, I mean, I think there's no better way than to end with the words of our elder mother, Pat Payne, and our leader and activist for sharing those words. The ancestors are watching. We are imagining a better world, a fairer world, really a transformed world. And I think that you're exactly right. When we can't predict those things anymore, we will really be moving into that day. And so I want to thank tonight for all of you all for showing up on Zoom and on Facebook. I want to thank the Greater Indianapolis branch of the NAACP. I want to thank the Education Committee of the NAACP here for all of the work that they've done. And I want to thank our panelists, Marshawn Wally, Flora Reicheneider, Heather McKinney, Patricia Payne, Terrell Berry, Valerie McCrae, and Jill English for showing up and with your generosity of spirit, with your intellect and rigor, sharing with all of these folks what we can do, what we should do, and how we can do all of this together if we will and are really connected to all of the things that you all have listed and named today. I just thank you so much. I have been blessed. I have really been just educated during this last 2 hours, hour and 45 minutes. And let's keep this going, folks. Let's not stop tonight. Check out all of the things that were included and listed on the chat, and all of the resources and the policies and the folks here. Every one of these panelists, from Marshawn to Dr. Floor to Heather to Pat to Terrell to Valerie and to Jill, they are open to getting questions and getting in touch with you and helping us do better. So thank you again. I'm Joseph Tucker Edmonds. I've enjoyed this time. Please, let's be in touch. And thank you for all the work we do. Yours in the struggle. Let's keep fighting.